Olive Schreiner writes during the transition of the 19th and 20th centuries, in a period in which South Africa, as we know it today, is taking shape. For almost a century, British colonial control is visible in the region. English became the language of the Cape and Natal colonial governments. In the Cape Colony, men, regardless of descent or skin color, had qualified franchise, with a proviso that they had to meet certain property and literacy requirements. The slogan, "Equal rights for all civilized men," captures this liberal tradition. The unfulfilled dream of Cape liberalism holds for many the promise that one day they too will be admitted to the Cape Colony's high political echelons. This is also the time in which the colonial or the identity constructs, political affiliations, and religious orientations as we know it today became established. Missionaries set up mission stations, converting large groups of people and extending their influence to the developing education system. Colonialism is changing with an ever sharper demarcation between upper and lower classes based on outward appearance, descent, literacy, access to capital and land. Large displacement of indigenous people are taking place. European influence gradually expands northward with the impetus of the fur trackers and British imperialism. Various frontier wars, the wars of dispossession, are fought. Gold and diamonds are discovered. Railroads are laid. The region is experiencing a move away from communalism and pastoral lifestyles to early industrialization, a development that would lead directly to the Anglo-Boer War and finally the establishment of the Union of South Africa. Writings and what we call literature today depends on literacy, a social skill that was introduced with colonialism in South Africa, but remained unattainable for the majority of the population. Education served as an instrument of social control, the deposition of colonial values, and the creation of a colonial elite. Mass education would not become available to people of European descent, to use the contemporaneous terminology, until the beginning of the 20th century, and the people of non-European descent only towards the middle and the end of the 20th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, those who could not read and write were part of a tiny section of the population. It is against this background of sweeping change that I excerpt some of Schreiner's statements on parasitism and refer to selections from her letters, where she mostly incidentally refers to servants in her immediate environment. I also present another voice, that of Katie Jacobs, a former slave, contemporaneous with Schreiner. Although this subaltern voice does not directly engage Schreiner, her presence helps us to hear the unheard voices of the servants of that time. Schreiner is known as an early feminist. Under the influence of Marxist thought, she writes in Woman and Labour in 1911 about the parasitism of women from the dominant class in society. And she writes, "Between that body of women, of the dominant class or race, who did not labour either mentally or physically, there has always been a necessity, a far more solid body of females who do not only perform the crude physical toil essential for the existence of society before the introduction of mechanical methods of production, but who were compelled to labour the more intensely because there was a parasite class above them to be maintained by their physical toil." This idea of women from a dominant class or race parasitizing on the labour of women from a lower class status has already been taking shape with Schreiner since the late 19th century. In a letter to Betty Molteno, she wrote in 1896 that she hated her word, hated women who always complained about their children. I think the modern wealthy and middle-class married woman tends to become very selfish and to fall into a complete state of mental and moral disease. She contrasts these upper-class women with the women of an earlier age, who even if their husbands were rich, worked in the fields and washed their own clothes. The modern middle-class woman of her time is a spoiled brat, she says. But the middle-class woman has servants and governess and all sorts of single women to do her work, and then she sits and howls that she hasn't everything she wants, and that she's so badly off because she has to bear children, etc., etc. It is these women that Schreiner wants to put back to work. It's this kind of woman we want to do away with and turn into a working woman. Even when women's suffrage comes out, Schreiner first wants to deal with the parasitic upper middle-class women who are mere toys and seekers of pleasure, because this is part of the condition of women as a whole, and the idea of individual freedom. In a letter to John X. Merriman, a member of Parliament, later Prime Minister, she wrote in 1906, "I cannot discuss the seemingly small question of franchise without tracing its relation to other vast and vital human problems. Prostitution, the whole body of sex problems, the terrible parasitism of the women of our wealthier classes, robbed of all forms of labor, becoming mere toys and seekers of pleasure. And the terribly underpaid and overworked condition of our women of the poorer classes, and the whole fixed problem of the right of the individual human to freedom." Mindful of her pronouncements on parasitism, my attention now shifts to Schreiner's references to servants in her letters. In a letter to Rebecca, her mother, the 19-year-old Schreiner writes on 10th of June 1874 about her work as a governess and her activities at Colesberg. I quote this passage in full, since the silences are more important to me. From the letter it appears that Schreiner had the same routine every day at Colesberg. She writes, "I think you will like to have some idea of the way in which I spend my days here, and it will be very easy to give it to you, as one day passes exactly like another. I get up pretty early and always find little things in the house to do, to see to after till breakfast time. As soon as that meal is over, and it's like all the others, a very hurried one, I go into school and we don't come out until 1, which is the dinner hour. And then it's over. I dress at once and go down with Mr. Weekly to the shop, where I stay until sunset. This is the hard part of my day's work, and I like it less and less every day. By the time we get up to the house, supper is generally on the table and being over, and the little one once put to bed, Mr. W and I get to do needlework, which we keep on until 10:30. We have no machine, so there is a great deal to do, but I manage to get through some in the morning school. Mrs. W is generally down at the shop all morning, but as we have 2 servants, I don't have much to do except see that they keep to their work." I want to argue that this description offers us more than a glimpse into a colonial household. Here we notice something about the ingrained, self-evident, and seemingly natural social stratification and the relationships between people. We do not find out what Schreiner's work as governess entails. Usually this type of work involves basic teachings, counseling, and child care. Schreiner's mother is obviously familiar with the work, and therefore no further explanation is necessary. In the domestic sphere, the work of women is often regarded as self-evident. This certainly applies to the work of the 2 servants. In Schreiner's description, the breakfast appears as if out of nowhere, as do the lunches and suppers. The servants' work, the preparation of meals, the cleaning of the house, and the many tasks that had to be performed without machines in Schreiner's late 19th century sphere, remain undescribed. even though the servants' jobs are obvious. They cannot work without her supervision. In this world, it goes without saying that a white 19-year-old could be the supervisor of the domestic servants. Presumably the unnamed servants are older non-white women, who for years would have been familiar with their work. The servants themselves remain only a category of labor, unnamed and without any possibility of individualization. By the way, the servants in Schreiner's letters remain mostly unidentified, except for a single case, where she mentioned the name Kruan. In a letter to her friend Jessie Rose in February 1894, she writes about her forthcoming wedding and her health. With the prospect of moving to Crowns Plaza, she offers a brief description of the wind and the river that flows past the house, and quite casually adds that she has the services of 2 servants. We are going to live at Crowns Plaza, that place where the wind always blows. The river flows just in front of the door. I shall have an old Kaffir woman and a little boy for servants. While her surroundings and her marital status changes significantly, there's a reassuring presence of the servants. Again, their obviousness is notable here. As a category of labor, some questions do not even arise, such as what is the bond between the old woman and the young boy? What are the connections of the old woman? Does she have a husband? Where is he? Is he coming along? Does she have children or grandchildren? Do the children come along? In the colonial frame of mind, servants do not appear to have extended human relations or connections. The inclusion of servants as part of the background and the natural environment is not exceptional, for it happens more often. In a letter in 1899 to Alice Green, Schreiner writes about her temporary residence Karreekloof, which is heavenly for her. With further clarification, she describes the sunset over the Karoo hillocks and the animals on the farm. Just as in a previous description, the self-evidency of the slaves is notable, with the accumulating ampersands, the and sign. The and-colored and black servants are literally inserted in between the descriptions of nature. The beginning of the letter reads as follows: "We seem to be living in heaven here. The only shadow on our happiness is that we shall have to go away again. But I won't think of that. There are 23 dogs here, and 500 ostriches, and there are sheep and horses, and colored and black servants, and lovely copies, on which the sun shines at sunset, as it only can in the Karoo. Oh, it's all so beautiful and restful." However, servants also have complex lives. How does a critic reach beyond the silences and attempt to reconstruct the life or lives? To reconstruct the lives of the servants on the Weekly's property or those who cross Schreiner's life in the Karoo and elsewhere is impossible. Therefore, an artifice is needed, where a servant's life can be presented and then only by approximation. I refer to Schreiner's meeting with Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman and his wife, Nellie, on Thursday, the 8th of April, 1909, and a note of thanks in which she refers to the APO with the comment, "I think your paper first rate." The APO is the newsletter, the newspaper of the African People's Organization, of which Abdurrahman was the president. A few months later, a profile about a former slave appears in the APO. It is contemporary to Schreiner at the time when she was busy preparing Woman and Labor. It is this profile of Katie Jacobs, also called Grieke, an emancipated slave. The profile article is unusual, for it's one of only a few slave narratives that are not based on criminal records. Katie Jacobs, 96-year-old, is presented as a woman who still moves about freely, is compos mentis, and in excellent health. She lives in the backyard of 63 Hanover Street, District 6, in a hovel, according to the APO interviewer, barely fit for human habitation. The interview was published in English, but here are enough indications that it was originally conducted in Cape Dutch or Afrikaans. In my rendition, here I have modified the excerpt slightly. Katie Jacobs was born into slavery on Mostard's farm at Calabash Kraal. As the child of a Malagasy father and a Cape mother, she was separated from her father at a very young age. Since, as slaves are therefore the property of their owners, they had no right to familial relations. She says, that's the subject. I started working when I was still little. When my boss got old and could no longer farm, he gave most of his chattels to his sons. I and some of the cattle and horses were given to Boss Quickie, and my mother and some more cattle were given to his other son in French Hook. From that day, I never again saw my mother, nor do I know what became of her. I always wanted to go see my mother. The boss, however, always refused my request. I think he was afraid that I would not return. The work on the new farm was hard, because it has never been farmed before. From sunrise to sunset, the land had to be cleared for planting. After working on the land with a pick and a shovel, Jacobs, Katie, had to help out in the kitchen at night. Sometimes she had to herd cattle, something she hated, not just because it was boring or because I wanted to go home, but because I had to wear men's clothes. Since she was ashamed of wearing men's clothes, she devised ways of concealing her true identity when encountering strangers. She says, I raised my stumpy clay pipe and pulled my slow hat over my eyes, so that I passed for years as a young boy. As a young girl, probably in her early teens, she became pregnant. But her first child died prematurely. The madam of the farm was expecting at the same time, and Katie had to stand in as a wet nurse. I was healthy then. My missus was sickly and I had to suckle her first child. I was like one of the family then. I slept on the floor in the dining room, near the bedroom, so if the cleaning bars wanted teeth, I was close. Life on the farm was demanding, and she was shambocked on occasion when some colts went missing. But there was also time, probably over weekends, that she could go dancing at night, on the condition that they had to be back by 2 o'clock. That's 2 o'clock at night. On slave emancipation, she tells that one day they were told together in the dining room, washed and dressed, where the magistrate announced that they would be freed 4 years later. During that time, she says, Jacob, my husband, came to me twice or thrice weekly on evenings, and I began to build castles in the air. He would work for me and get a little hut of our own, where we could dwell together and be happy. On Emancipation Day, the 1st of December 1838, it poured with rain, and Jacob arrived at the farm drenched and frantically wanted to leave. While performing my usual duties, I was startled by an angry voice demanding whether I was coming along. Turning around, I recognized my husband in a violent passion. His boss was cruel and shambocked his slaves as often as he fed them. That morning, Jacob's boss chased his former slaves off the farm, armed on horseback, warning them that if he caught any of them on his land, they would be shot. My boss and Mrs., though somewhat irritated at the news of their prospective liberation, of our prospective liberation, were on the whole kind, and I was not overjoyed at the idea of leaving them. Katie says, I was about 19, 20 at the time. My missus wept at the idea of me leaving her. No, you must stay, she cried. Think of my son whom you have suckled and nursed, and who has grown so fond of you. What will become of him? No, you must stay, you cannot go. Even though he was upset, Jacob finally gave way. My boss offered to take Jacob and me into his service at £1.10 and £1.10 shillings and 10 shillings a month, respectively, and food and house. Katie and Jacob would remain on the farm for another 3 or 4 years after emancipation, before settling in the Durbanville district and working on several farms. My boss never wanted me to be baptized. But then after emancipation, I was baptized and could get married. Her father, who also worked on Koiki Bosted's farm, died a year before he could be emancipated. My old father, she says, died in slavery and so did not live to enjoy the God-given freedom, which is the right of every human being. Katie Jacobs had 13 children, and by 1910, 65 grandchildren. As a reflective person, Schreiner is not unaware of the stratification of women and especially servants in her society. On the 22nd of June 1904, she wrote this revealing letter to her sister Etienne, Henrietta, in Hanover and Hannover, from which I quote a full paragraph. No people who have not all their own work to do can realize how grateful one should be to servants, even the stupidest and worst, for what they do. There is no case on record of any cook or housemaid or scullery maid doing any literary or intellectual work of any kind. And the woman who combines all these forms of labor, even for a small household of 2, becomes only a labor machine and has no thought or life beyond. It may be the most useful and best life a woman can lead, but to suppose it can be combined with any real mental or creative work of any kind is idiocy. Managing a large household with several servants is a distracting life, but it's quite different from having to do everything yourself. All your brain goes into your hands. Although Schreiner's ideas about the place of women, the stratified nature of their labor, constantly developed over the course of her life, she evidently has a blind spot in her letters about the non-white servants in her close circle. From this paragraph, the indispensability of servants of Schreiner is clear, where her own creativity and well-being, by implication, like that of women from the upper classes, also depends on that of women from the lower classes. Servants and their omnipresence are taken for granted. They exist on the almost invisible margins of Schreiner's world. It is a broad category of labor without any individuality that forms the basis of her intellectual presence in the world. She herself admits they are the hands that make her creativity possible. In her letters, these people are treated with the same casualness as others do in the colonial space. They appear as beings without history, without language and opinion, and without any significant human connection. Thank you very much.